So in the previous lesson, we had talked about setting these literal values. So these are what's known as literals. And this basically means that we're setting a fixed value, which is going to, now it's going to equal that apple AB is going to be equal to 1. So it's indefinitely, whenever we're accessing and calling this value within our code, it's going to actually retain a value of 1. And we can use any number of these identifiers in order to hold values. And there's a lot of different types of literals. So what we're looking at now are just numerics. So these are integers. They hold a value, a numeric value to that identifier. So whenever we're calling to there, we hold the value of 1. There's also commonly our strings. So I can just call strings, and these are indicative of quoted items. So these are a bunch of characters strung together. You could add in white space and a whole bunch more. And now whenever I look up apple AB, I'm going to see that it actually contains that new value, strings white space. So there are some naming conventions. Just to finish off with these literals, so we can have any number of literals. We can have arrays as literals, we can have objects as literals, and commonly we are using objects and arrays quite often. So I'm going to quickly run through those. And as well, there can also be Boolean values. So I'm just going to call this one boo. And so Boolean values are either true or false. So those are indicated with a 1 and a 0. And mainly we're using Booleans for conditional statements. And as well, we're going to be talking about that in upcoming lessons. So I don't want to get too far ahead with what we're discussing in regards to JavaScript. So this is what's known as a Boolean. And it can either be true or. So I'm just typing here on an angle, so that's why I'm adding in all these extra characters that I was hitting. So this one here is an int. And then this one is a string. So I'm going to run through some of the common types. So we have another one that's an object. So this is how you define an object, and we notice that they all look the same here in the beginning, and it's just what our actual value is going to be. So these identifiers can all be they can all be formatted in the same way, and we're also going to talk about what's available for formatting here. So you don't want to set a variable and then set something else with that same variable value, because what that's going to do is that's actually going to overwrite the value. So with objects, we have what's called a paired value. So we have a name or a key, and then we have an identifier. So I'm just going to put John, and we can add in a number of different objects here. So we could have our email or something like that. And notice that these are the same way that we're presenting strings. So if we can also have integers and booleans within our objects. So I'm just going to quickly write something out here and maybe do something like age, and then set that equal to 20. And so on. So we can keep adding them indefinitely, separating them via comma, and then when we're done, all we have to do is end that curly bracket. And then lastly, so this one here, just to keep consistent here, so that's an object. And then lastly, the other common one is an array. So I'm going to call it my array. And you set the arrays with the square brackets. So similar to objects where you can list a bunch of items in there, and then they're just comma separated. And the same thing with the strings and the characters. And you're probably wondering, okay, well, what happens? So I saw what happened here when I output this in the console, but what happens when I output an object? What happens when I output an array? Just show you what these outputs actually look like within the console. So when I refresh it, we see that the object gets output, we get all the values listed there, and the same thing with the array, we get all those values listed there. And it's defined and listed as an object. So getting back into what our rules are for creating these identifiers, so they can start with any letter. They can actually start with a $ as well. So you could do something like that. They can start with an underscore. They can start with any one of those characters, but they can't start with numbers. So it goes green because that's going to throw an error. And the reason for that is because, as we saw here, the numbers aren't quoted. So you have to always be careful when you are naming things, because you could run into some issues. It might think that it's a number. It looks at the first character there and it sees a number and it thinks that that's a number, but then it hits an A and that makes absolutely no sense, and it'll throw an error for there. When you're naming it, upper, lowercase, any one of those letters from the alphabet are okay. And also, no other odd characters are allowed, so you can't do something like asterisk. So you definitely can't do something like and. And as well, there's one other thing to keep in mind. You can't do values that actually are defined values within JavaScript. So I can't do variable console or something like that, because that's going to actually conflict with the reserved words. So keep in mind that we can't do that, but we can do the $ in that. So quite a lot what we can do, some things that we can't do. And then this is an example of all the different literals that, not all the different literals, but the common literals that are being used on a regular basis. So I encourage you to take a look through these, maybe go over to CodePen, try them out, see what you can get to happen. So I'm going to just list these within CodePen, get rid of that one. I can tidy it up as well within CodePen, so really cool. And we don't actually see anything happening, so I can open up a console here within CodePen. And also I can open up the browser console as well, and I see that I've got all of this information gets listed out here from the console log, and then I can work with that as well. So in the next lesson, we're going to dive even deeper into how to use JavaScript. So these are the basics, and you should definitely understand all these basics to JavaScript, because forming this good solid foundation, understanding all these literals and how to set up the identifiers in them is really going to help with determining and coming up with the logic that you need to be able to produce when you create more complex JavaScript. So building up the base first, and then we're going to get into more complex pieces of JavaScript that are actually going to use all of these literals within them.